You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome back to the Occult Rejects. Today we're getting into something really fascinating. The idea that sacred spaces were never just places you looked at. They were places that did something to you. And the more you look into it, the weirder it gets. Because all across the ancient world, people kept building in stone. They carved chambers underground, raised pyramids, built massive temples, tombs, and domes. And a lot of these places don't just look impressive. They feel different. They change the way sound moves. They change the way a voice hits the air. And in some cases, they seem to change the way a place hits your body. So that's what we're looking at today. We're going from underground chambers in Malta and Ireland to Chichen Itza and Hagia Sophia to whispering domes in India and London. And we're asking a simple question that opens up into something much bigger. Were these sacred spaces just symbolic, or were they part of the ritual itself? Because once stone starts shaping sound, and sound starts shaping experience, you're not just dealing with the architecture anymore. You're dealing with the resonance, you're dealing with the vibration, you're dealing with the possibility that some of these places were working on the body as much as the mind. The body as a resonant chamber, a neuroacoustic deep dive. Before a stone sings, flesh listens. Before a chamber amplifies chant, before a dome stretches a syllable into something that feels eternal, the human body must already be an instrument capable of resonance. Every sacred structure we're about to enter, from subterranean temples in Malta to the vast vault of Hagia Sophia, depends on a biological fact older than the architecture itself. The nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to vibration. Sound is not a mystical substance. It's a mechanical pressure oscillation. Air molecules compress and rarefy. Those oscillations enter the external ear, strike the tympanic membrane, and are transmitted through the ossicles, malleus, incus, and stapes, into the fluid-filled cochlea. Inside the cochlea, the basilar membrane acts as a living frequency analyzer. Its base responds more strongly to high frequencies, its apex to low, creating a tonotopic map in which the sound is sorted spatially before it is consciously heard. Hair cells then transduce that motion into electrochemical signals, which travel through the auditory nerve into the brainstem, through the cochlear nucleus, superior olivary complex, and inferior colliculus, before ultimately reaching the auditory cortex. Already, before belief enters the picture, the body has performed astonishing signal processing. Hearing is not passive reception. It is conversion, sorting, timing, prediction, and integration. The body is not waiting for sacred sound. It is built for it. And sacred sound rarely lives at the bright upper edge of hearing. Much of it lives lower, where chant settles into the chest, where drums move air, where stone begins to answer back. Male vocal fundamentals commonly fall between roughly 70 and 150 hertz, and several ancient ritual chambers appear to reinforce energy in that same region. Low frequencies behave differently from high ones. High frequencies localize easily. They decay quickly and help us pinpoint a source. Low frequencies wrap. They diffract. They penetrate. They build standing waves in enclosed spaces. And crucially, they are not only heard, they are felt. That distinction is fundamental. Research by Todd and colleagues showed that low-frequency acoustic stimulation can activate the vestibular system, especially the otolithic organs involved in linear acceleration and head position. Deep sound, then, is not processed purely as sound. It also registers as orientation, motion, and bodily presence. It enters through the ear, but it does not stay in the ear. It recruits balance. It recruits space. It recruits the body's sense of where it is. This is one reason resonance feels so powerful in enclosed ritual environments. When low-frequency reinforcement overlaps with natural resonant bands of the thoracic cavity, Often somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 150 hertz, depending on body size, the chest vibrates sympathetically. Mechanoreceptors register the oscillation. The sternum hums. Breath feels thickened by pressure. The experience of resonance is not metaphorical. It is corporal. When a voice fills the room also fills the body. And sound does not arrive alone. It arrives coupled to breath. Chant is not simply vocalization. It is respiration, organized into ritual form. Sustained tones lengthen exhalation. And extended exhalation is one of the most direct ways to increase parasympathetic activity through vagal pathways. Stephen Porges' Polyvagal theory places the vagus nerve near the center of autonomic regulation, social engagement, and states of calm. Slow vocalization, especially when paired with controlled breathing, can increase vagal tone and shift the organism toward regulation rather than alarm. This has measurable psychological consequences. Heart rate variability, the subtle variation in time between heartbeats, is one of the clearest markers of autonomic flexibility and parasympathetic balance. In a striking study, Vickoff and colleagues recorded choir singers performing structured hymns and found that their breathing synchronized through musical phrasing and their heart rhythms began to oscillate in unison. The group was not merely singing together. It was becoming physiologically coupled. That matters for ritual. Chant unifies breath. Breath modulates heart rhythm. Heart rhythm shapes affective state. Once a group begins breathing and vocalizing together, the body moves toward coherence. Sacred sound becomes autonomic choreography. The brain adds another layer. It is rhythmic by nature. Electroencephalography reveals oscillatory activity across multiple bands: delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. And these rhythms are not incidental background noise. They are part of how the brain organizes perception, attention, memory, and conscious state. Rhythmic external stimuli can entrain these patterns. Periodic auditory input produces frequency-tagged neural responses measurable by EEG. The brain locks onto tempo. Repetition is not just heard. It becomes timing inside the cortex. This is why repetitive ritual sound matters so much. In shamanic drumming traditions, beats often fall within the 4 to 7 hertz range associated with theta activity, internally directed attention, and memory-related processes. The point is not that every ritual beat mechanically forces trance, but that rhythmic sound can bias the nervous system toward particular modes of awareness. The body is not infinitely plastic, but it is pliable. Repetition moves it. And that helps explain something even more ancient and widespread. Chant is not just one's tradition's habit. It may be one of humanity's most stable vocal technologies. A 2025 study comparing chants across 7 traditions reported that chants share a recognizable acoustic profile: relatively slow melodic movement, sustained voicing, comfortable low pitch, and stable vowels, and that these traits reliably increased listeners' perceived relaxation in playback experiments. Human cultures may keep rediscovering chant because chant works on human bodies in similar ways. It stabilizes breath, reduces informational clutter, and favors resonance over semantic speed. That observation becomes crucial once we turn to architecture. A sacred building that makes ordinary speech muddy but allows slow vowels to bloom is not poorly designed. It is optimized for a different human use. It shifts priority away from information and towards state. In such a space, the goal is not rapid comprehension. The goal is immersion. Music and chant also reach into reward circuitry. When sound produces chills, those involuntary waves of awe, tension, release, and shiver, it causes dopamine to be released in the striatum. Anticipation engages the caudate, and emotional peak engages the nucleus accumbens. Sound can recruit the same reward systems involved in desire, expectation, and significance. Oral research further suggests that experience of perceptual vastness can reduce self-focus and increase pro-social orientation. Vastness is often treated as visual, but it can also be acoustic. When sound lingers, expands, and exceeds ordinary scale, the nervous system infers magnitude. The self contracts, the environment swells. Group ritual deepens that effect. Collective music making has been associated with increased social bonding. Synchronized movement and vocalization increase cooperative behavior. Synchronized activity can raise pain tolerance, likely through endogenous opioid mechanisms. Ritual sound does not only alter internal state, it binds people together. It turns many nervous systems into one coordinated event. And the brain is always integrating across senses, not merely hearing in isolation. Temporally aligned multisensory stimuli become more salient to the nervous system than isolated ones. Sound arriving with synchronized visual change, spatial confinement, rhythmic motion, or shifting light produces stronger encoding and stronger felt significance. A voice in darkness is one thing. A voice in darkness that reverberates while a narrow beam of light enters a cylindrical moment is something else entirely. The nervous system treats convergence as importance. That is the bridge into everything that flows. Because once we understand the body as a resonant chamber, sacred architecture stops looking decorative and starts looking operational. A chamber can reinforce low frequencies already powerful to the human organism. A long reverberation can stretch sound beyond ordinary conversational time. A narrow passage can focus propagation. A dome can dissolve location and make the voice feel omnipresent. Stone does not create these sensitivities. It exploits them. The occult traditions of vibration understood this in symbolic language. Pythagorean thought framed the reality through harmonic ratio. Hermetic doctrine spoke of correspondence between levels of being. Nada Brahman identified ultimate reality with primordial sound. Modern neuroscience uses different terms: entrainment, oscillatory synchronization, autonomic regulation, multisensory binding. Acoustics use another: modal reinforcement, reverberation, diffusion, wave propagation. Different vocabularies, same recurring insight. Vibration is one of the deepest interfaces between organism and world. So before we descend into Malta, walk the passage at Newgrange, clap before Kukulkan's pyramid, or stand beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, we have to start here. The body is already prepared. It is a resonant vessel, a vestibular instrument, a cardiovascular oscillator, a reward-sensitive prediction machine, and a social node capable of synchronizing with other bodies through sound. Once that is clear, stone no longer looks silent. It looks like the next instrument. Next, we have stone as instrument. Advanced acoustic physics inside sacred architecture. Every enclosed space is an equation. Before ritual, before theology, before incense, procession, chant, and doctrine, there is geometry. And geometry shapes pressure. When a sound is produced in a room, it does not simply travel outward and vanish. It encounters boundaries. It reflects, scatters, interferes, reinforces, focuses, and decays. And the exact pattern of that behavior depends on volume, proportion, surface material, air conditions, and shape. Sacred architecture is never acoustically neutral. It may be accidentally resonant or intentionally resonant, but it is always resonant. Stone does not merely contain sound, it transforms it. That transformation begins with a basic physical fact. When sound strikes a surface, its energy is divided. Some are reflected, some are absorbed, some are scattered. Hard, dense materials like limestone, marble, and granite reflect a great deal of sound energy, especially at low and mild frequencies. Soft, porous materials, cloth, bodies, wood furnishings, carpets absorb more, especially in the higher bands. Irregular carvings, columns, reliefs, niches, and vault transitions scatter sound, breaking up strong directional reflections into more diffuse fields. Even before we begin naming measurements, the principle is already clear. Sacred buildings are pressure-shaping machines. The most famous measure of this behavior is reverberation time, or RT60. RT60 is the time required for sound energy in a space to decay by 60 decibels after the source has stopped. Sabine's famous formula remains foundational. RT60 equals 0.161V/A, where V is room volume in cubic meters and A is total absorption in Sabins. In simple terms, large volume plus low absorption produces long reverberation. Small volume plus high absorption produces short reverberation. But reverberation is not uniform across all frequencies. Low frequencies generally persist longer because they are less readily absorbed by air and most building materials, while higher frequencies decay more quickly. In stone architecture, this matters enormously. Marble, limestone, and granite absorb very little across much of the audible range, which means sound can remain alive in the room for far longer than it would in an ordinary domestic space. In Hagia Sophia, reverberation times in lower frequency bands exceed 10 seconds in measured and modeled studies. In smaller chambers like the hypogeum, overall reverberation is shorter because the volume is smaller, but specific low frequency bands can still become strongly reinforced and subjectively persistent. Reverberation stretches time. It blurs edges. In ritual terms, the end of a syllable is not silence. It is extension. It is transformation. But RT60 alone does not tell us how a space feels in the first instant after sound is made. For that, we need early decay time, or EDT. EDT measures the initial rate of decay over the first 10 decibels and extrapolates it to a 60 decibel estimate. This matters because the ear is especially sensitive to early reflections and first impressions of spaciousness. A building can have an extremely long RT60 while still giving the listener a momentary sense of clarity at the onset of sound if early reflections arrive quickly from nearby surfaces. Columns, arches, galleries, and wall irregularities can create dense early reflection clusters that preserve the shape of a syllable before the long reverberant tail blooms behind it. This is why some sacred spaces feel paradoxical, both intelligible and engulfing. You hear their attack clearly, then the building takes the sound and spreads it into atmosphere. That leads directly to clarity. Clarity Index C80 compares early arriving sound energy within the first 80 milliseconds to later arriving reverberant energy. High C80 favors articulation and is good for speech and detailed rhythmic music. Low C80 favors blending, sustain, and tonal fusion, better for chant, drones, and slow melodic lines. Many monumental sacred spaces tend toward lower C80 values, sacrificing crisp verbal articulation in favor of sonic immersion. That is not a flaw. It is a shift in priority. In such buildings, theology is experienced not only as language, but as atmosphere, meaning it is not merely delivered, it is suspended. Speech Transmission Index, or STI, tells a similar story in more practical terms. STI measures how speech modulations survive in a space. Long reverberation, strong late reflections, and background noise all reduce intelligibility. In large dome basilicas and stone sanctuaries, STI without amplification can be poor. Consonants smear. Fair speech collapses. Yet historically, these spaces remain central for proclamation, prayer, recitation, and authority. Why? Because sacred speech in these environments was not structured like casual conversation. It became slower, more declamatory, more repetitive, and more melodic. Architecture shaped delivery. The building itself taught liturgy how to move. Another major factor is envelopment, often described through lateral fraction or LF. LF means the proportion of sound energy reaching a listener from the sides rather than only from the front. High lateral energy increases the sense of spaciousness and immersion. A sound that returns only from a head feels locatable and external, but a sound arriving from multiple lateral directions begins to surround the listener. In basilica with side aisles, columns, and transverse surfaces, lateral reflections can be strong. In dome spaces, curved geometry and multiple reflection paths can generate diffuse sound fields that reduce directional certainty altogether. Much of what people describe as sacred vastness is partly this phenomenon. The sound no longer seems to belong to one source. It fills the air from all directions. To understand how researchers capture these properties, we need the impulse response. An impulse response is the acoustic fingerprint of a room. Researchers create a broadband transient with a balloon pop, starter pistol, hand clap, or more precisely, a swept sine signal, and record how the room responds over time. That recording contains direct sound, early reflections, late reverberation, spectral imbalances, and timing information. From it, researchers can extract RT60, EDT, C80, STI, LF, and modal behavior across frequency bands. Through convolution, mathematically combining a dry recording with a measured impulse response, they can simulate how any sound would behave inside that building. This is how researchers have reconstructed the sound of Byzantine chant in Hagia Sophia using digital aureolization techniques. Once we have the global picture of decay and clarity, we can move into a more intimate layer of behavior, resonance. Reverberation tells us how long sound lives in a space overall. Resonance tells us which frequencies the space favors. This is where architecture starts to feel less like a container and more like an instrument. When sound reflects between boundaries, certain frequencies reinforce because their wavelengths fit the room's dimensions. These reinforced frequencies are room modes, often experienced as standing waves. In a simple rectangular space, modal frequencies can be approximated by F equals C/2, V, NX/LX, 2, plus NY/LY, 2, plus NZ/LZ, 2. I mean, if you're watching this, look at the screen. Where C is the speed of sound, LX, LY, and LZ are the room dimensions, and NX, NY, NZ are integers describing modal order. Ancient ritual spaces are rarely perfect rectangles, but the principle still holds. Whenever room dimensions align with portions of a wavelength, some frequencies become more powerful than others. Low-order axial modes, those formed between major opposing surfaces, are usually the strongest in small or simple chambers. If those modes overlap with common vocal fundamentals or drum frequencies, the room appears to answer certain sounds more strongly than others. This is part of what seems to happen in the hypogeum's oracle room, where low-frequency reinforcement has been measured in ranges overlapping the male vocal register. Selection is not always smooth. Sometimes geometry sculpts sound in stranger ways. Comb filtering occurs when direct sound and delayed reflections combine with consistent time offsets, producing a spectrum of repeating peaks and nulls. The frequency response begins to look like teeth of a comb. At Chichen Itza, the steeped facade of El Castillo behaves like a sequence of discrete reflectors, with each step returning a reflection slightly later than the one before it. The superposition of those staggered reflections creates the famous descending chirp analyzed by de Klerk and de Grake. A clap becomes a sweep. Geometry turns broadband impulse into spectral contour. Another strong effect is flutter echo. Flutter echo occurs when sound bounces rapidly back and forth between large parallel reflective surfaces. Unlike lush reverberation, flutter is rhythmic, almost precursive. It creates audible repetition at intervals determined by the distance between surfaces. In the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, parallel limestone walls generate repeated reflections that can create striking flutter effects. The walls become timing devices. The space produces its own pulse. Curved geometry adds yet another layer. Domes, apses, vaults, and whispering galleries do not simply reflect sound in straight lines. They bend its trajectories. Concave surfaces can concentrate sound toward focal regions, while circular or elliptical walls can guide sound along their curvature through repeated, shallow, angled reflections. In spaces like St. Paul's Cathedral, this produces whispering gallery effects, where speech hugs the wall and travels with uncanny coherence. In Gol Gambaz, the vast dome and gallery geometry generate prolonged reverberation and guided whisper transmission across distance. Curvature changes the rules. Flat surfaces reflect. Curved surfaces redirect, concentrate, and sometimes seem to animate sound. Long, narrow passages behave differently again. A passage like the entrance corridor at Newgrange can function as a waveguide. In a waveguide, sound propagation is constrained by the boundaries, and lower frequencies often travel especially efficiently along the axis. Reflections from the side walls reinforce directional propagation, while the narrowness suppressed the sense of openness found in large chambers. Sound in a passage is not free. It is channeled. In darkness, with limited visual cues, that channeling intensifies bodily focus. The passage becomes a sonic corridor. One caution matters before we move back into the case studies. A building can possess a powerful acoustic affordance without us being able to prove that its builders calculated that affordance in the modern scientific sense. That distinction is important. Sometimes the evidence allows us to say, with confidence, that a chamber or monument reinforces particular frequencies, stretches decay, guides sound, or produces striking echo effects. Sometimes it even allows us to say those effects would have been obvious to repeated users and therefore available for ritual exploitation. But that is not always the same as proving original acoustic intention. Rupert Till's careful work on the hypogeum is useful precisely because it confirms distinctive acoustic behavior while also warning against looser overclaiming. Sacred acoustics may be planned, discovered, refined through repeated use, or all three at once. The building does not need an architect with modern acoustic theory to become an instrument. It only needs a culture willing to listen. At this point, a deeper pattern emerges. Reverberation shapes duration. Early reflections shape impressions. C80 shapes clarity. STI shapes intelligibility. LF shapes immersion. Modal behavior shapes which frequencies bloom. Comb filtering shapes spectral color. Flutter echo shapes rhythm. Curvature shapes focus and diffusion. Passage shapes propagation. Sacred architecture is not randomly resonant. It is geometrically inevitable. And once ritual takes root inside such spaces, ritual adapts. Chant lengthens because the room rewards sustain. Syllables slow because fast speech dissolves. Drones thicken because the building reinforces them. Drum patterns change because repetition interacts with reflective delay. Calls project because architecture magnifies them. The physics is not separate from the rite. It becomes part of the rite's evolution. Stone disciplines sound. Sound disciplines the body. Body disciplines belief. And now, with the language of architectural acoustics in place, we can return to the case studies with deeper ears. When we descend into Malta, we will not simply hear echo. We will hear low-frequency modal reinforcement. When we enter Newgrange, we will hear a waveguide. When we reach Chichen Itza, we will hear comb filtering and flutter. When we stand beneath Hagia Sophia, we will hear reverberation stretched into theology. The chamber is no longer a background. It is an instrument. And next we have the hypogeum in Newgrange at full acoustic depth. Before we move forward into pyramids, domes, and imperial vaults, we descend again. But this time, we do not descend as tourists. We descend as acousticians. We descend as neurologists. We descend knowing that every chamber is a pressure field waiting to be mapped. Last part gave us the language: reverberation, modal reinforcement, standing waves, wave guides, low-frequency propagation, envelopment, and decay. Now we bring that language underground, to two of the oldest sacred structures in Europe, places where ritual architecture does not reach upward into the sky, but downward into darkness. They are not open monuments. They are interior thresholds. They compress the body, constrain the voice, and alter perception before a single myth is spoken. This matters because underground sacred architecture does something different from monumental surface architecture. A pyramid projects authority outward. A dome suspends sound above, but a subterranean chamber turns vibration inward. It encloses, it concentrates. It makes the body feel surrounded not by air alone, but by matter. Stone is no longer a background. It presses close. It becomes womb, tomb, amplifier, and witness. And that beginning matters as much as the chamber itself. Sacred acoustics are not only produced by the room at the end of the path, but by the choreography of approach: narrowing corridors, lowered ceilings, darkness, enclosure, walls, turns, delays, and controlled access. A threshold is never just a doorway. It is a device for changing the body before the ritual climax arrives. As sound shifts in a corridor, as footsteps sharpen, as outside noise falls away, the participant is not merely moving through architecture. The participant is being tuned by it. Who gets to enter, how far they enter, where they stand, and what they are allowed to hear are all part of the acoustic design of sacred power. Walls do not exclude bodies. They intensify experience for the bodies permitted within. The hypogeum and Newgrange are different structures in different lands, built by different peoples for different ritual worlds. And yet they share a deep logic: descent, confinement, residence, transformation. In both, the sacred is staged not as spectacle for the distant eye, but as passage for the enclosed body. To enter them is already to begin the rite. During the Temple period, roughly the 4th millennium BCE, the Maltese archipelago became home to one of the most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric cultures in Europe. They left behind freestanding megalithic temples, Gigantea, Hagar Quim, Nandra, and then did something stranger. Instead of building upward, they carved downward. Beneath the modern streets of Paola lies the Halsafieni Hypogeum, discovered accidentally in 1902 during construction work. A 3-level subterranean complex cut entirely from Globigerina limestone. Its earliest phases are generally placed around 4000 to 3600 BCE, with use and expansion continuing for centuries. It was not a natural cave. It was engineered. Chambers were shaped with deliberate curvature. Doorways were carved to imitate the forms of freestanding temple architecture above ground. Niches, recesses, and apertures were cut into the stone as though the builders were reproducing, in the underworld, the sacred grammar of the living world. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of thousands of individuals there. This was not merely a ritual room. It was a necropolis, a city of the dead. The burial evidence suggests secondary deposition. Bones collected, curated, possibly rearranged as if the dead were not simply laid to rest here, but managed through repeated ritual encounters. Some skulls were isolated. Red ochre traces imply ceremonial painting. In a Neolithic burial context, ochre is often linked symbolically to blood, regeneration, life force, and cyclical return. Some scholars interpret the site primarily through ancestor veneration. Others emphasize complex mortuary ritual tied to cyclical cosmology, where death is not termination but transition. Even the architecture seems to argue for this reading. The chambers below mirror the forms above. Why create a temple underground that echoes one on the surface unless the descent itself mattered? Unless the underworld was understood not as absence, but as a corresponding realm? That symbolic depth helps explain why the hypogeum has never stopped attracting legend. The most famous story is the tale of a school group that allegedly vanished inside in the early 20th century. Children said to have had wandered into a sealed passage and never returned, their cries echoing for days. There is no verified archival basis for the story, and as history, it remains unproven. But the legend persists because the hypogeum feels like a place where disappearance makes intuitive sense. It is threshold architecture, a built underworld. Corridors fold into darkness. Sound behaves strangely. Orientation loosens. The imagination does the rest. Archaeologists working with ritual reconstruction models have suggested the site may have been used for mortuary rites, ancestor invocation, and initiatory descent rituals, ceremonies in which the living entered the realm of the dead and emerged altered. The rounded chambers, the ochre, the spirals, the sensation of being swallowed by stone, all of it invites the rebirth reading, even if we hold that interpretation carefully and refuse to overstate what can actually be proven. We do not know their language. We do not know their myths. We cannot name their gods with confidence. What we do know is that they invested extraordinary labor into carving resonant chambers underground, and that such labor was not spent on shelter. It was spent on sacred interiority. The oracle room, so named by early excavators, sits near the center of that mystery. It features a curved niche and red ochre spiral motifs. Spirals reoccur throughout Neolithic Europe and are often interpreted as symbols of cycle, return, soul emotion, life-death rebirth, or cosmological turning. Similar motifs appear at Newgrange and elsewhere across Atlantic Europe, suggesting not a single shared religion, but a reoccurring symbolic grammar of rotation, passage, and return. And then there are the skulls. Some recovered crania appear narrow and elongated in natural dolichocephalic form, helping fuel later occult and fringe speculation about lost lineages or non-human priesthoods. There is no credible evidence for such claims, but myth often fastens itself to whatever looks like an exception, and the hypogeum has always looked like an exception. And modern occult afterlife, though, rests above all on sound. Esoteric writers often describe the oracle room as a prehistoric frequency chamber, designed to alter consciousness. The grounded version is simpler and stronger. The acoustics of the chamber reinforce low-frequency male vocal tones. Occultly, one might say something more poetic and perhaps more faithful to the experience down there. The earth answers when you speak. That may be the cleanest bridge between scholarship and mystery. Whatever the builders believed, they carved a place where voice becomes larger than the body, where vibration feels like presence, and where the line between tomb and temple, between burial and initiation, grows thin enough to hum. Now, with the history grounded, we can descend into the acoustic anatomy. The hypogeum chambers are rounded, irregular, and asymmetrical, but irregularity does not eliminate modal behavior. It complicates it. Acoustic measurements taken in the oracle room revealed reinforcement peaks centered roughly in the 70 to 75 Hz and 110 to 120 Hz bands. Rupert Till's later re-examination urged caution and more rigorous protocol, but still confirmed that the room exhibits distinctive low-frequency behavior without requiring speculative overreach. 110 Hz tone has a wavelength of about 3.12 meters. If one or more principal room dimensions approximate half or quarter wavelength multiples of that value, reinforcement becomes likely. Even when a chamber is irregular, curvature and recess can produce modal clustering, several slightly different resonant behaviors overlapping in ways that still privilege particular low bands. The room does not need to be mathematically tidy to be acoustically selective. It can still favor certain frequencies. It can still sing back. Layer reverberation on top of that. The hypogeum is small relative to something like Hagia Sophia, so its overall reverberation time is shorter. But reports still suggest that in some chambers, especially in the mid-bass region, reverberation can extend for several seconds depending on measurement position and occupancy. A tone does not simply sound and vanish. It lingers, overlapping with the tones that follow, producing harmonic smearing and a sense of sustained vocal bloom rather than discrete sonic events. And now the beginning returns in full force. Low-frequency reinforcement between 70 and 120 Hz overlaps with male vocal fundamentals, thoracic cavity resonance, and known bands of vestibular sensitivity. So in the hypogeum, a chant in that reinforced range is not only heard, it is felt. The chest vibrates, the larynx resonates, the skull receives bone-conducted energy. The body becomes part of the room's response. This is where the comparison to modern vibroacoustic therapy becomes useful. Not because the hypogeum was a prehistoric clinic, but because the analogy clarifies mechanism. Modern vibroacoustic therapy uses low-frequency sound delivered through transducers to influence muscle tension, autonomic state, and bodily awareness. The hypogeum contains no electronics. It does not need them. Stone walls reflect and reinforce. The air becomes the transducer, the body becomes the receiver. And the sensory conditions intensify everything. In complete darkness, visual dominance collapses. Auditory and somatic signals move forward. A sustained 110 Hz tone in such a space does not merely produce a room tone. It produces envelopment. Bone conduction bypasses some of the outer ear filtering that usually helps us externalize sound sources. The vestibular system, lightly stimulated by low-frequency pressure oscillation, begins to influence orientation. You do not simply feel that you are standing in a chamber. You feel that the chamber has entered you. Using the earlier vocabulary, we can describe this more precisely. Mid-bass reverberation is long for the room size. C80 is likely low, favoring blending over articulation. STI is likely poor for ordinary speech, but acceptable for slow chant and repeated tones. Lateral envelopment is strong because reflections arrive rapidly from multiple directions in a small room, irregular volume. Early reflections merge almost instantly with direct sound, making the singer's own voice sound larger, thicker, and less locatable. What a physicist would call pressure behavior, a ritual participant might call presence. And presence may be the real function here, not in the supernatural sense, but in the phenomenological one. A voice that seems larger than the body is not merely louder. It is destabilizing. It blurs boundaries between self and space. In a mortuary context, among bones, spirals, ochre, and darkness, that matters. The architecture does not just host belief. It manufactures a condition in which belief becomes easier to feel. If the hypogeum is the earth as enclosed residence, New Grange is the earth as a timed revelation. 500 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, on a bend of the River Boyne in Ireland, a massive mound of earth and stone was raised. New Grange, built around 3200 BCE during the Irish Neolithic, stands within the Bruna Boyne complex alongside Noath and Douth, one of the most significant prehistoric ritual landscapes in Europe. The mound is approximately 85 meters in diameter and around 13 meters high. 97 curbstones ring its perimeter, many engraved with spirals, lozenges, and geometric motifs. The most famous, Curbstone 1, bears the triple spiral that has become almost synonymous with Neolithic Ireland. But New Grange is not simply decorated. It is timed. Above the entrance is the famous roof box, and at winter solstice sunrise, a beam of light penetrates that opening, travels down the 19-meter passage, and illuminates the inner chamber for roughly 17 minutes. For agricultural people living by seasonal cycles, that moment would not have been abstract astronomy. It would have been a promise. The darkest point in the year yields to returning light. New Grange did function as a tomb. Cremated remains were found in the recesses, but tomb is too thin a word for what this structure does. It stages a cosmological drama. Darkness, confinement, and then illumination. Burial and rebirth, night and return. Later, Irish myth layered new meanings into this much older architecture. In medieval literature, the mound became Bruna Boyne, associated with Tuatha Dé Danann, with the Dagda, and with Angus. It becomes an otherworld dwelling. The Sidhe inhabit such mounds. Time behaves differently within them. Enter and one night becomes years. This is not merely folklore ornamenting an old ruin. It is a myth recognizing something the architecture already performs. A dark corridor compresses the body. A hidden chamber awaits within. At a precise calendrical moment, light pierces the darkness and transforms the interior. The mound performs liminality physically. Myth names what the body already experienced. Modern Druidic and pagan groups still gather at winter solstice outside New Grange, often interpreting the monument as a site of solar rebirth and descent return initiation. Archaeologists remain more cautious, emphasizing burial, calendrical alignment, and ritual landscape context. But both views, in different languages, are responding to the same fact. The structure was engineered for revelation. And once light is engineered precisely, the next question becomes unavoidable. What about sound? Acoustically, New Grange behaves very differently from the hypogeum. The hypogeum is a cluster of enclosed chambers. New Grange is a passage leading to a chamber. Its entrance corridor is not just a path through stone. It behaves like a waveguide. In a waveguide, sound propagation is constrained by the dimensions of the passage, and lower frequencies often travel efficiently along the axis because lateral dispersion is restricted. In practical terms, narrow stone corridors tend to channel sound rather than let it bloom freely. Low-frequency chant or percussive energy can travel deeper into the monument with less attenuation that one might expect from an open environment. Studies and acoustic archives connected with Irish passage tombs have suggested modal behavior in the approximate 95 to 120 Hz region. Again, the familiar neighborhood of roughly 110 Hz appears, not because that frequency is mystical, but because the room dimensions repeatedly fall into ratios that support wavelengths in that range. A 110 hertz wave is about 3.12 meters long. If width, height, or recessed dimensions approach meaningful fractions of that wavelength, reinforcement becomes likely. Newgrange's cruciform chamber, with its side recesses, effectively create multiple reflective cavities feeding energy back into the center. Each alcove acts as a partial resonator. Impulse response data from Newgrange suggests prolonged low-frequency decay relative to ordinary built spaces. Stone reflects efficiently. Earth mass surrounding the chamber suppresses outside noise and supports the sense of interior isolation. The result is not only acoustic reinforcement, but acoustic contrast. Inside Newgrange, the world outside disappears. Imagine the simplest possible experiment. A single drum strike in the chamber. The initial transient excites a broad spectrum. The brighter high-frequency components die first. The low-frequency energy lingers. The sound literally darkens as it decays. Align that with winter solstice sunrise. The chamber sits in darkness. Light enters the roof box. Sound blooms in the same moment. Temporarily aligned stimuli are especially salient to the brain, while emotionally charged moments strengthen memory consolidation. Newgrange is not only symbolic architecture, it is cognitive choreography. The passage intensifies that effect before the chamber is even reached. As one moves down the corridor, sound behavior changes. Footsteps sharpen. Breathing becomes more audible. Reflection from the side stones arrive rapidly, producing micro-reflection patterns that constrain propagation and make the passage feel sonically alive. The body is already being prepared. The corridor is not a neutral entryway. It is a perceptual conditioning. There is bodily component here too. Low-frequency sound can stimulate vestibular systems. In a narrow passage, where opposing stones are close, reflected low frequencies overlap quickly and can form pressure maxima and minima along the corridor. Stand in one place and a tone may feel relatively weak. Stand a short distance away and it may feel fuller in the chest or skull. Ancient participants would not have expressed this in equation, but repeated ritual use could easily have taught them where the sound felt strongest. Sacred knowledge does not require calculus. It requires repetition, memory, and listening. Like the hypogeum, Newgrange invites a modern analogy without collapsing into anachronism. Stone as transducer, earth as amplifier. When a tone is initiated, pressure oscillations reflect from stone boundaries and grow stronger at modal bands. The air vibrates, the body vibrates. The monument does not merely enclose ritual, it participates in it. The surrounding soil mass damps some high-frequency leakage and reinforces the feeling that low frequencies are true language of the chamber. That does not prove occult intentionally, but it does help explain why cultures so often interpret resonant enclosed spaces as spiritually charged. Humans evolved in caves, hollows, and natural cavities. One of the oldest uncanny experiences may have simply been this. Call into darkness and something answers. Is it the cave, spirit, ancestor, earth? The physics come first, theology follows. And that may be the deepest lesson of Newgrange. The structure does not merely symbolize death and rebirth. It makes the body pass through an acoustic and visual sequence that feels like death and rebirth. Confinement, darkness, resonance, emergence, illumination. Architecture becomes initiation without needing a single word. With the hypogeum in Newgrange, we have mapped the underground in full. Liminality as architecture, descent as conditioning, the chamber as resonator, the passage as waveguide, low frequency reinforcement as bodily event, and multisensory timing as ritual intensifier. And now we leave the earth, because the next step in the story is not inward resonance, but public spectacle, open air, monumental scale, and a structure that answers a clap with the voice of a bird. The pyramid that chirps. Chichen Itza was not built for contemplation. It was built for spectacle. Rising in the northern Yucatan between roughly 800 and 1200 CE, Chichen Itza became one of the most powerful urban centers of the Maya world, a city where political authority, ritual drama, warfare, astronomy, and monumental design converged in stone. Unlike many classic Maya cities farther south, Chichén Itzá bears strong signs of Maya-Toltec interaction, suggesting political exchange, elite migration, or conquest-linked cultural fusion. Whatever the exact mechanism, the result is unmistakable. This is architecture that does not hide power. It stages it. Platforms elevate rulers and priests above gathered crowds. Colonnades and warrior carvings multiply the imagery of martial order. The urban plan itself reads like a script for public authority, built to be seen, to be felt, and, as we are about to hear, to answer back. At the center stands El Castillo, the temple of Kukulkan, rising about 30 meters high. Its 4 staircases each contain 91 steps, with the summit platform included. The total reaches 365, a number often interpreted as calendrical symbolism. Whether that arithmetic was primarily intent or later emphasis remains debated, but the larger point is not in doubt. This building was designed to bind stone to cosmic order. During the equinoxes, triangular shadows cast by the stepped terraces create the famous illusion of a serpent descending the northern balustrade, visually aligning with serpent heads carved at the base. Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, was not merely a deity in an isolated theological sense. He was movement, sky, wind, rulership, and cyclical renewal, a figure tied to celestial motion and, in some Mesoamerican traditions, to Venus, that volatile planet of war cycles and ritual timing. The city did not simply observe the heavens. It translated them into events. And those events were not symbolic in a harmless modern sense. Chichén Itzá was a ritual political machine. Human sacrifice at the second cenote is archaeologically documented. The Great Hall Court, the largest in Mesoamerica, transforms cosmology into civic theater. The ball game here was not sport in the modern sense. It was a public myth enacted under institutional control. Reliefs depicting decapitation and serpent imagery make the ideological stakes explicit. Blood becomes symbol. Sacrifice becomes renewal. Violence becomes cosmologically framed. Whether the rituals at Chichén Itzá can be directly mapped onto the Kh Papavu is a complicated scholarly question, but the thematic overlap is unmistakable. This is a place where the underworld, the heavens, rulership, and death are all made public. That audience is the key difference between Chichén Itzá and the underground sites we have just left behind. The hypogeum and Newgrange compress experience inward. Chichén Itzá projects it outward. It does not trap a few participants inside darkness. It organizes vast attention in open air. Here the sacred is no longer an intimate enclosure. It is a mass address. And once sound enters that equation, the city becomes stranger still. Modern visitors standing before El Castillo often clap once and hear the pyramid answer with a brief descending chirp. Guides love to call it Quetzal Echo, a serpent reply, or the voice of Kukulkan. The effect itself is real. The interpretation is cultural. We cannot prove that the builders intentionally engineered the acoustic response in the modern scientific sense. But once an architectural anomaly exists in a culture deeply attuned to astronomy, symbolism, ritual, timing, and sensory drama, intention becomes less important than recognition. Even if such an effect were first encountered accidentally, it could easily have been ritualized, interpreted, and folded into performance. The building does not merely symbolize myth, it performs it. Stand at the base of the pyramid of Kukulkan. Clap once. What returns is not a simple echo. It drops in pitch, compresses in time, and resembles the descending cry of a bird, often likened to the resplendent Quetzal. Often likened to the resplendent Quetzalcoatl. Often likened to the resplendent Quetzalcoatl. Quetzal. Often likened to the resplendent Quetzal. This is not folklore invented by tourists. The acoustic effect was modeled mathematically by de Klerk and by de Grick, who showed that the step geometry of the pyramid can generate the descending chirp through structured reflection. Each stair riser behaves as a discrete reflector, a broadband impulse, like a hand clap, strikes the staircase, and reflections return from successive steps with slightly increasing delays determined by their spacing. Because those delays are regular, the interference pattern is also regular, and the result is a spectrally sculpted echo. The staircase does more than create a static spectral pattern. Because the reflections arrive in a sequential cascade, the ear perceives a brief descending sweep, a chirp. The structure converts impulse into contour. This is why the effect matters culturally. Whether or not the builders aimed specifically at the Quetzal-like signature, the acoustic result aligns uncannily with symbolic material already alive in the culture. During the equinox, the serpent descends in a shadow down the staircase. Acoustically, a descending response answers the clap from the same structure. Vision and audition converge. The myth is not only represented, it is reenacted across senses. In a ritual context, that matters enormously. A priest or officiant standing in the right location does not simply speak before a monument. He speaks beside a structure that appears to answer. That answer need not be verbally intelligible to be persuasive. It only needs to be strange, repeatable, and associated with symbolic meaning. Once that happens, acoustics becomes authority. Move from the pyramid to the Great Ball Court. At roughly 168 meters long and 70 meters wide, with long parallel limestone walls rising on either side, it is one of the most impressive acoustic corridors in the ancient world. There is no enclosing roof, no intimate chamber wall close to the body, and yet the sound behavior remains highly structured because the court's geometry is severe, linear, and reflective. Parallel surfaces are the classic setup for flutter echo. Sound strikes one wall, returns to the other, and continues to bounce back and forth in repeated intervals. The delay between reflections depends on wall separation. At these scales, the reflections are far enough apart to become clearly perceptible as rhythmic repetition rather than a fused blur. Lubman documented the striking echo behavior of the court, including long-distance transmission effects and repeated flutter-like patterns. This means the court can impose its own temporal structure on sound. A clap does not simply vanish into the air, it ripples. A call does not merely travel, it acquires trailing pulses. A speaker stationed along the long axis gains projection far beyond what might be expected in an open field, because the walls help guide and return energy rather than allowing it to disperse freely. The architecture becomes a timing engine. Now place that inside the ritual. The ball game in Mesoamerican thought was not trivial entertainment. It was a cosmological drama, contest, sacrifice, descent, and transformation. In such a court, sound does not just accompany the event. It magnifies it. A strike, a cry, a proclamation, a drumbeat, the crowd's reaction are all shaped by the reflective corridor. Authority becomes louder. Tension lasts longer. Rhythm becomes environmental. And there is another layer. Large open spaces with aligned walls can produce a kind of acoustic focusing along the main axis, while lateral reflections from the walls increase the sense of immersion even without a roof. The ball court offers an outdoor analog to lateral fraction. Sound arrives not from only ahead but from flanking stone surfaces, making speech and impact feel larger than their source. What ought to be open-air sound acquires an architectural afterlife. This is political acoustics in the most literal sense. A ruler or priest addressing a crowd in such a place does not rely on voice alone. He speaks through stone. The city lends him projection. In the underground structures, acoustics worked inward, concentrating attention into enclosed bodies and darkened chambers. At Chichen Itza, acoustics work outward. They scale experience for the many. Novelty becomes important. Surprise becomes useful. When a clap before El Castillo returns as an unexpected chirp, the nervous system registers discrepancy. Prediction is violated. Attention spikes. In ritual terms, the architecture can generate moments that feel like proof. The building answers. Therefore, the myth feels confirmed. The same logic applies to the ball court in a different register. Repetition, delay, and large-scale projection create a sense that speech and sound carry beyond ordinary human limits. In the crowd, and the dynamics intensify further. Human bodies absorb mid and high frequencies while disturbing low frequency energy. Add a crowd, and the dynamics intensify further. Human bodies absorb mid and high frequencies while disturbing low frequency energy differently. A full gathering changes clarity, decay, and transmission. More importantly, crowds synchronize perception. People gasp together, chant together, move together, look in the same direction. Sound in monumental ritual space is never purely acoustic. It is social acoustics. And that scale matters because Chichén Itzá is empire-facing architecture. This is not the private initiation of a small subterranean chamber. This is public theology. The ruler or priest does not need to explain his authority in abstract philosophical terms when the pyramid chirps, the court ripples, the serpent descends in shadow, and the city's geometry repeatedly stages cosmic confirmation. We left the womb of the earth and entered the theater of empire. Next, we ascend into one of the most acoustically documented sacred spaces on earth, a structure where reverberation no longer chirps or pulses, but hangs in the air for more than 10 seconds and turns sound itself into heaven. In Christian theology, the logos, the word, is not just speech. It is a divine creative principle, the force by which reality is spoken into being. Hagia Sophia was built to give that idea of architecture. In 532 CE, after the Nika revolt nearly shattered Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I commissioned a structure that would redefine sacred building forever. Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. Constructed between 532 and 537 under Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, it fused Roman engineering with Christian cosmology into an imperial declaration carved in stone. Procopius wrote that the dome seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The image still works because the building was never meant to feel merely constructed. It was meant to feel revealed. Hagia Sophia was not only a church, it was imperial theology made sensory. Byzantine political thought imagined divine order mirrored in imperial rule. The emperor stood as earthly steward of sacred order. Inside Hagia Sophia, incense, chant, candlelight, mosaics, processions, and proclamation combined into a total environment that demonstrated that order. Worship and governance were not separate performances. They were the same performance seen from different altitudes. But Hagia Sophia's power was never only visual. Its theology was sonic too. Byzantine Christianity treated light and sound as manifestations of divine order. Chant did not simply deliver text. It transformed text into atmosphere. Words were elongated into resonance until semantic meaning and acoustic presence began to blur into one another. Later, Hezekiah spirituality would systemize the power of sacred repetition. But Hagia Sophia already belongs to a spiritual universe that understands repeated sacred sound as a lever on the soul. When you enter Hagia Sophia, the eyes rise first because the architecture commands them to. The central dome floats some 55 meters above the floor, carried by pendatives and ringed by windows that fracture incoming light into radiance. The pendative is not just a structural trick. It is a metaphysical gesture in masonry. The transition from square base to circular dome, from the geometry of earth to the geometry of heaven. And acoustically, that transition matters too. Pendatives, semi-domes, arches, vaults, and galleries multiply reflection paths. Hagia Sophia does not behave like a whispering bowl. It behaves like a luminous cloud generator. Close your eyes and the real miracle becomes audible. Sound does not fall quickly here. It hangs. Measured impulse responses taken inside Hagia Sophia reveal decay times approaching 11 seconds in lower frequency bands. A sustained vowel does not end when the singer stops. It dissolves into a continuous field. When sound lingers that long in golden light, the effect does not feel mechanical, even though it is. It feels eschatological. It feels like time has thinned. Then history turns, and the same dome begins to hear another sacred language. In 1453, after the Ottoman conquest, Hagia Sophia became a mosque. Minarets were added, carpets softened the floor, Arabic calligraphy entered the visual field as proclamation. The building heard Greek chants and Arabic recitation alike. An Islamic sacred thought carries its own theology of voiced revelation. The Quran is not merely text, it is a recitation. Revelation is sounded before it is read. Sufi traditions intensify that principle through dhikr, repetitive remembrance in which sacred sound becomes a vehicle of inner dissolution and return. Different theology, similar acoustic truth. Sacredness is not only believed, it is performed in vibration. That is why Hagia Sophia's layered identities deepen rather than dilute its aura. For nearly 1,000 years, it stood as the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. For centuries more, it functioned as an imperial mosque. It became a museum in 1935, then returned to mosque status in 2020. Few buildings on Earth have carried so many spiritual and political identities without losing their acoustic soul. Modern legends swirl around it. Angels, hidden chambers, energy vortices, apparitions, none of that is needed. The architecture itself explains enough. When reverberation stretches beyond conversational time, when voice loses obvious source location, when light and sound both exceed ordinary scale, the building makes the invisible feel tangible. Hagia Sophia turns doctrine into sensation. It makes the word not merely understandable, but inhabitable. Reverberation in Hagia Sophia is not just long. It is stratified. In the lower bands, especially around 125 and 250 hertz, reverberation extends toward the edge of what feels architecturally reasonable, with modeled and measured values reaching roughly to 10 to 11 seconds in some conditions. Around 500 hertz, the decay remains enormous, while higher frequencies gradually shorten as air absorption, surface losses, and scattering take greater effect. This means the building is acoustically weighted downward. Lower bands remain alive longer. Higher frequencies fade sooner. The result is a darkened acoustic spectrum, in which bass and lower mid-range energy linger beneath the glitter of the initial sound. That matters physiologically. Lower frequencies couple more strongly to the body. Chest resonance, vagal settling, vestibular sensitivity, and somatic envelopment all respond more readily to these bands. Hagia Sophia is not just reverberant. It is bodily weighted. And that weighting changes with furnishing and use. Carpets absorb more upper frequency energy, shortening brightness while leaving the low end relatively alive. Occupancy matters too. Human bodies absorb mid and high frequencies, changing the balance of clarity and sustain. The Hagia Sophia of an empty tourist hour is not acoustically identical to the Hagia Sophia of a full imperial liturgy. But across conditions, the building favors duration, especially in the lower bands. It lengthens sound into atmosphere. If Hagia Sophia were only long decay, it would dissolve everything into mud. It does not. Early reflections arrive from nearby surfaces. Columns, galleries, arches, semidomes, within the first tens of milliseconds. That preserves the onset of sound. The first consonant of a phrase can still strike the ear with shape before the long field blooms behind it. That is where early decay time becomes spiritually interesting. You hear something close to clarity at the beginning of a phrase, and then the building overtakes it. Meaning appears, and then it is drawn upward into atmosphere. The architecture does not erase language instantly. It lets you grasp it, then immerses it. Clarity Index C80 helps explain why vowel flourishes here. In Hagia Sophia, late reverberant energy dominates more than it would in a speech-optimized room. That means the architecture favors sustain, blend, and tonal fusion rather than crisp articulation. Byzantine chant is perfectly suited to such a condition. It is built from elongated vowels, melosomatic motion, modal contour, and often the sustained presence of the ison, the drone beneath melodic movement. In such a room, the drone becomes architectural. The ison is not merely sung. It is prolonged by stone. The building adds a voice of its own. Not a new pitch exactly, but a field that sustains the sung tone beyond breath. This is one reason Byzantine sacred music in such a space can feel less like melody moving through a room and more like a room slowly revealing what melody was already inside it. In a space like Hagia Sophia, STI without amplification is low. Temporal modulation blurs, consonants smear. Ordinary prose loses precision. But liturgy in such a building was never meant to sound like a lecture hall. It was chant, proclamation, repetition, antiphony, and procession. It was language already adapted to reverberation. This helps clarify one of the deepest tensions in the acoustics of religion. Some sacred traditions privilege the intelligibility of the word, while others lean into the mystery created when the word begins to dissolve into atmosphere. A dry acoustic makes doctrine clearer. A reverberant acoustic makes doctrine larger. One favors comprehension, the other favors immersion. In a diffused field environment, sacred language arrives not only as a message, but as an event. Not only something to be understood, but something to be entered. The listener receives the meaning twice. First as text, then as atmosphere. The architecture becomes the difference between hearing a message and inhabiting one. Hagia Sophia's interior is not only long in decay, it is wide in arrival. Side aisles, galleries, semi-domes, and curved transitions send sound back from multiple angles, increasing lateral energy and perceived envelopment. When reflections arrive from many directions, source localization weakens. The voice begins to feel less emitted than diffused. In a political and theological setting, that matters. Beneath such a dome, the emperor's proclamation or the choir's chant does not seem to belong fully to one body. It radiates. It hovers. It takes on atmospheric authority. This is not a whispering gallery effect. It is nearly the opposite. A whispering gallery preserves directional coherence along a curved boundary. Hagia Sophia dissolves coherence into clouds. A dome is never just a dome in Hagia Sophia. The central canopy is carried and extended by semi-domes, arches, exagere, vault transitions, marble revetments, and hard reflective surfaces that continually redirect energy. Sound rises upward, strikes curvature, splits into multiple paths, and returns in staggered times. That overlap creates density rather than singular echo. The building does not ping, it blooms. Processional movement matters here too. Byzantine liturgy was not always stationary. Voices moved, clergy processed, choirs could be spatially differentiated. In a highly diffused environment, this creates a floating field of sacred exchange. The architecture does not simply enlarge one fixed source. It braids multiple moving sources into one atmosphere. Sound becomes liturgical weather. One of the great achievements of modern acoustic archaeology is that Hagia Sophia can now be studied not only as stone, but as recoverable sound field. Researchers at Stanford CCRMA captured impulse responses in the building using balloon pops placed at key liturgical locations. From that data, one can reconstruct direct sound, early reflections, reverberation tail, and spectral character. Through convolution, these measured responses can be applied to dry recordings of Byzantine chant, producing oralizations of how the chant would behave in the building. This is more than a laboratory trick. It demonstrates a crucial historical truth. Chant style is inseparable from architectural response. Singers in long reverberant rooms naturally leave more space, sustain longer, and allow the building to finish their phrases. The room becomes part of the ensemble. Hagia Sophia produces awe not only visually, but acoustically. The echo outlasts expectation. Sound persists beyond the ordinary timescale of speech. The brain infers magnitude from duration as much as from size. At the same time, music-induced chills correlate with dopamine release in reward circuitry, and reverberation extends anticipation. A climatic phrase in Hagia Sophia does not collapse the moment it is sung. It expands into the air, prolonging tension and release. The building becomes a reward amplifier. Hagia Sophia does not prove heaven. It simulates what heaven might sound like if heaven were made of delayed light, suspended breath, and returning wavefronts. We have now passed from underground resonance to public spectacle to celestial diffusion. Next, we move into comparative dome acoustics, Golgambas in St. Paul's Cathedral, where curvature behaves differently. whispers travel impossibly far, and sacred geometry begins to sound less like clouds and more like secret transmission. If Hagia Sophia made sound feel like heaven, the next structures do something subtler and in some ways stranger. They make sound feel secret. Hagia Sophia diffuses voice into clouds. Its dome dissolves location and turns chant into atmosphere. But not every dome behaves that way. Some preserve direction. Some bend sound along curvature instead of releasing it into a vast reverberant field. Some carry whispers farther than speech has any right to travel, making the building feel less like a container of sound than a guide for it. In such spaces, acoustics stop feeling merely grand to begin to feel intimate, uncanny, almost conspiratorial. In such spaces, acoustics stop feeling merely grand and begin to feel intimate, uncanny, almost conspiratorial. The sacred is no longer only vast, it is listening. Gol Gumbaz houses the remains of Muhammad Adil Shah, but it is not the kind of tomb that whispers humility. Completed in 1656 in Bijapur, it still feels less like a tomb than a challenge issued to silence itself. The building is a centralized mass of stone, a cubic base crowned by a vast hemispherical dome spanning roughly 44 meters in diameter, among the largest masonry domes in the world. Unlike Hagia Sophia's layered basilican complexity, Gol Gumbaz is concentrated. It is a more singular engine of curvature. Within the structure runs the gallery that made Gol Gumbaz famous, the Whispering Gallery, where a softly spoken phrase can travel along the circular wall and be heard with startling clarity at a distance. When sound is emitted tangentially to the wall, a portion of the wavefront remains coupled to the curvature through repeated shallow angle reflections. Instead of dispersing rapidly into the room, the energy hugs the boundary. Coherence is prolonged. The sound survives the journey longer than intuition expects. Gol Gumbaz bends sound, guides it, and returns it with a strange intimacy. The dome begins to feel less like a ceiling than a living boundary, not merely enclosing utterance, but carrying it. And it does not only carry whispers. Its sheer volume and hard reflective surfaces create long reverberation as well, enough to turn footsteps into pronouncements and speech into aura. What makes Gol Gumbaz especially important is that these effects are spatially stratified. The gallery is not architecturally elevated. It is acoustically privileged. Sound behaves differently there than on the floor below. Position changes perception. A ruler, priest, or initiated participant standing in a privileged acoustic zone does not merely speak. He speaks with the aid of curvature. Within broader Islamic thought, that has symbolic weight even if the building was not constructed as a Sufi teaching device. The creation imperative, kun, be, places divine command at the origin of reality. Revelation is not only concept but utterance. In that atmosphere, Whispering Dome becomes more than an acoustic curiosity. It becomes metaphor made material. The unseen carries the word. Stone returns what the body alone could not preserve. The tomb answers, and in answering it suggests that the voice can exceed mortality. Travel now to London. After the Great Fire of 1666, much of the city lay in ruins, and among its losses was old St. Paul's Cathedral. Sir Christopher Wren's replacement, completed in 1710, was not simply a restored church. It was a national statement. The Great Dome announced resilience, Protestant identity, imperial continuity, and the survival of civic order after catastrophe. Within that monument sits one of the most famous whispering galleries in the Western world. At the base of the inner dome runs a circular gallery where a whisper can travel roughly 34 meters along the circumference and arrive with uncanny clarity on the opposite side. Again, curvature guides sound through repeated shallow angle reflections. Energy clings to the wall. The signal survives the path. But the experiential character of St. Paul's differs from Gol Gumbaz. Gol Gumbaz feels grand and uncanny in an imperial tomb register. St. Paul's Whispering Gallery feels sharper, more intimate, almost clandestine. Hagia Sophia dissolved speech into the atmosphere. St. Paul's preserves it as secret. Psychologically, that is extraordinary. A whisper is supposed to be local. But in St. Paul's, the whisper is detached from that local scale and carried outward without becoming public in the way a shout would. It remains whisper-like even while traveling. In a sacred setting, the symbolism almost writes itself. Prayer has long been imagined as intimate speech heard at an impossible distance. The God who hears the inward murmur, the confession not spoken aloud, the petition carried beyond the body, all of those theological patterns resonate with the whispering gallery, whether or not Wren intended such correspondence. This is why St. Paul's becomes fertile ground for symbolic interpretation. Not because it proves some occult instrument, but because the period around Wren was saturated with the symbolic prestige of geometry. Sacred geometry, in Christian, Hermetic, and later Masonic traditions, was never merely useful. It was intelligible. The square, circle, compass, and vault signified a world ordered by proportion. A building that can carry a whisper without showing its path feels like a lesson in invisible forces. It demonstrates, in audible form, that space can be engineered to transmit what the eye cannot follow. Place Hagia Sophia, Golgumbas, and St. Paul's side by side, and the differences become illuminating. Hagia Sophia diffuses. It produces a broad, enveloping field in which sound loses clear source location and becomes atmosphere. Golgumbas guides and enlarges. It combines reverberant presence with strong curvature-driven transmission along its gallery. St. Paul preserves intimacy through circumferential travel, transforming whisper into impossible reach. These are not random quirks. They are dome typologies. Different curvatures generate different perceptual worlds. Concave volumes can focus or partially focus energy. Multi-part dome systems with semi-domes and architectural transitions generate distributed return and diffusion. Circular galleries encourage boundary-hugging propagation. And once you begin hearing those differences, the next threshold appears almost naturally. What happens when architecture stops merely guiding the audible and begins operating near the edge of hearing itself? Below 20 hertz lies infrasound, generally beneath the threshold of ordinary conscious hearing, but not necessarily beneath the threshold of bodily response. The ear, vestibular system, mechanoreceptors, and broader nervous system can all respond in complicated ways to very low frequency energy, especially at higher intensities or under particular conditions. Leventhal reviewed low-frequency noise effects and noted associations with discomfort, anxiety, and stress responses in environmental settings. Salt and Huller proposed that outer hair cells and vestibular structures may respond to frequencies below traditional auditory thresholds. This does not prove paranormal claims. It does something more useful. It provides a physiological account of why environments rich in low-frequency pressure fluctuation can feel uncanny, oppressive, or charged even when the listener cannot identify a clear sound. Large stone volumes are relevant here because room dimensions determine modal possibilities. A sufficiently large enclosed volume can support very low frequency standing wave behavior, depending on geometry. That does not mean every dome is producing dramatic infrasound all the time. And caution is essentially because ghost frequency narratives are often sensationalized far beyond the evidence. But it does mean that very large chambers may generate subtle pressure conditions that contribute to atmosphere, especially when wind, crowds, drums, or sustained tones excite the room in ways that brush against subaudible regions. In a dark or symbolically charged environment, that matters. Unease does not need a demon. It may only need low-frequency pressure interacting with a body primed by expectation. This brings us back to vibroacoustic therapy. Modern vibroacoustic systems use low-frequency sound, often around 30 to 120 hertz, delivered through transducers in chairs, beds, or platforms to influence muscle tone, autonomic state, tension, and bodily awareness. Ancient monuments did not contain speakers or electronic drivers. But when their geometry accumulated and reinforced low-frequency energy in the hypogeum, in Newgrange, in large domes, in enclosed stone chambers, the room itself became a passive transducer. The air carried the oscillation, the stone preserved it, the body absorbed it. This prevents us from treating ancient acoustics as mere symbolism. The effects are not just poetic, they're somatic. From low frequencies at the edge of feeling, move upward into one of the most discussed bands in contemporary neuroscience, gamma, particularly around 40 hertz. Gamma band actively is associated with perceptual binding, attentional coordination, and aspects of conscious integration. Experimental work in animal models suggested that 40 hertz sensory stimulation could entrain neural oscillations, and human research into 40 hertz auditory and audiovisual stimulation continues in exploratory form. Human literature is still developing, but the broader principle is already clear. Rhythmic sensory input can influence neural timing. That principle matters far beyond the laboratory. Ancient chant already produces overtone structures. Reverberant interference creates amplitude envelopes and beat structures. Repetition organizes breath. Delay shapes expectation. None of this means ancient buildings were tuned to gamma in a modern scientific sense. That would be overstated, but it does mean that ritual sound environments have always interacted with oscillatory nervous systems. Once you recognize that, modern cultural parallels become impossible to ignore. Contemporary electronic music often uses sub-bass energy in the 40 to 60 hertz range, delivered through large speaker systems capable of producing whole-body vibration. Participants describe transcendence, ego softening, collective fusion, ecstatic release. Megachurches combine lighting, long reverberant music, repetition, and emotionally structured crescendos. Psychedelic-assisted therapy carefully curates music to shape internal experience. The technologies are different. The control is finer. The amplifiers are electronic instead of architectural. But the principle is ancient. Geometry or technology shapes sound. Sound shapes physiology. Physiology shapes meaning. Stand in a cathedral where reverberation lasts 11 seconds. Stand in a warehouse where the sub-bass hits the sternum like a second pulse. The aesthetics are widely different. The symbolism is different. The moral worlds may be different. But the underlying mechanism is the same story in different clothing. Pressure waves sculpting bodies and minds. And that means we are finally ready for the last step. Not another case study, not another chamber, a synthesis. Stand in darkness. No cathedral, no pyramid, no dome, just breath. Your heart beats in rhythm. Your lungs rise and fall in pressure cycles. Neurons fire in coordinated bursts across shifting frequency bands. Delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. While the cochlea maps sound along its spiral and the vestibular system continuously calibrates balance through motion and microvibration. Before any temple was cut, before any dome was raised, before any liturgy was sung, the body was already an oscillatory organism. You are already an instrument. That is the deepest truth beneath this entire episode. Sacred architecture did not invent resonance. It externalized it. It took the hidden rhythms of the body and built environments that mirror, magnify, and manipulate them. Across Malta, Ireland, Mexico, Byzantium, India, and London, across tomb, passage, pyramid, basilica, and whispering gallery, sacred structures perform three overlapping functions. They are resonant machines, synchronization machines, and meaning machines. They are not mystical categories. They are biological and physical processes wrapped in cosmology. As resonance machines, each site reveals a different way geometry shapes pressure fields, and pressure fields shape perception. In the hypogeum, low-frequency modes reinforce the range of the human voice until the chamber seems to answer from inside the body. In Newgrange, the passage acts as a waveguide, channeling resonance toward a chamber built for timed revelation. At Chichen Itza, stepped stone turns a clap into a descending chirp. In Hagia Sophia, immense volume and reflective surfaces stretch vowels into fields of suspended presence. In Golgumbas and St. Paul's, curvature bends whispers into coherence. Different buildings, different effects, but always the same principle. Stone shapes sound, and shaped sound shapes the nervous system. That shaping is never purely auditory. Low-frequency energy couples with the chest and skull. Reverberation alters time perception. Flutter echo imposes rhythm. Diffuse fields erase source location. Guided propagation preserves it. Vestibular systems respond to low-frequency stimulation. Bone conduction bypasses some of the usual filters of ordinary hearing. The body does not merely listen to architecture. It enters into feedback with it. But sacred buildings do not act only on isolated individuals. They act on groups, and that is where they become synchronization machines. Durkheim called it collective effervescence, the charged intensity produced when bodies gather in ritual alignment. Turner described liminality. Bell showed how ritualization disciplines bodies into patterned forms of attention and hierarchy. Add physiology, and the picture sharpens. Group chant synchronizes breathing. Synchronized breathing influences heart rate variability. Synchronized movement increases cooperation and pain tolerance. Long reverberation blurs individual contributions into a shared sonic field. Architecture amplifies synchrony. Synchrony strengthens cohesion. Cohesion stabilizes belief. That is why sacred architecture is never just beautiful space. It is social technology. And yet, resonance and synchrony alone do not produce religion. They produce conditions, altered salience, bonded groups, embodied intensity, changed attention. Meaning enters when culture interprets those conditions. That is where sacred buildings become meaning machines. In Malta, resonance becomes an oracle voice. In Ireland, darkness and solstice light become rebirth. In Mexico, chirping echo becomes a serpent descent. In Byzantium, reverberation becomes heaven. In Islamic metaphysics, geometric unity reflects divine oneness, and sound becomes a vehicle for the one made experientially present. In Pythagorean thought, the universe is structured by harmonic ratio. In Nada Brahman, ultimate reality is primordial vibration. In Hermetic doctrine, vibration becomes a principle of being itself. Modern neuroscience speaks differently. Oscillatory, synchronization, multisensory integration, reward circuitry, vagal regulation, temporal binding. Different languages, same event. Stone does not create metaphysics. It makes vibration palatable enough that metaphysics feels self-evident. And this is not just retrospective interpretation. It is now an active area of preservation. Scholars of historical acoustics increasingly treat the sound behavior of sacred architecture as part of the heritage itself, not as an accidental side effect of masonry. A church, mosque, tomb, or temple is not fully preserved if only its walls remain while its acoustic life is forgotten. That is why impulse response capture, oralization, and acoustic reconstruction matters so much. They do more than satisfy curiosity. They preserve the sensory logic of ritual space. Let us hear how buildings once taught bodies to feel. The study of sacred acoustics is not fringe speculation. It is a conversation expanded into time, memory, and vibration. This is why awe occupies such an important place in this story. Awe is not just admiration at scale. It is neurocognitive recalibration. When reverberation extends beyond visual expectation, the brain infers magnitude. When a clap at Chichen Itza returns as a descending cry, prediction error spikes salience. When light and sound converge at Newgrange, multisensory timing intensifies encoding. While chant swells beneath a dome, anticipation stretches and reward circuitry responds. Or reduces self-focus and increases prosocial orientation. Sacred architecture induces awe not only through size, but through time. The room outlasts the body's ordinary sense of event, and in that extension, the nervous system enters accommodation. Then there is the edge of the sacred, where audibility starts to blur into sensation. In massive volumes, low-frequency modes approach the lower margins of hearing, and in some cases, infrasound or near-infrasonic energy may contribute to unease, pressure, or altered bodily awareness. Pair that with darkness, enclosure, symbolic expectation, or ritual tension, and the body begins to register something that language cannot easily name. In ancient settings, that unnamed sensation could become presence, spirits, warning, divinity, or haunting. The physics does not erase the experience. It clarifies the pathway. And above that low edge sits another modern echo of ancient intuition, gamma. External rhythmic stimulation can influence neural timing, and experimental work on 40 Hz sensory stimulation suggests that targeted rhythmic input can modulate neural activity. Ancient chant was not designed with EEG readouts in mind, but rhythmic vocalization inside resonant chambers inevitably produces amplitude, modulation, harmonic layering, and temporally structured sensory input. Modern clubs use sub-bass arrays to create full-body vibration. Megachurches combine light, music, repetition, and amplification to intensify emotion. Psychedelic therapy clinics curate soundtracks to guide inner experience. We have not abandoned sonic temples, we have digitized them. That realization makes the deep pattern across all the sites almost impossible to miss. Underground tombs concentrate vibration inward. Pyramids project echo outward. Domes suspend sound above. Whispering galleries bend intimacy sideways along stone. Passages guide resonance like arteries carved into earth. Every structure relies on the same core family of behaviors: reflection, delay, interference, resonance, guided propagation, and entrainment. And the body answers through an equally consistent set of pathways: cochlear tonotopy, vestibular coupling, vagal regulation, HRV synchronization, dopamine reward, endorphin-mediated bonding, gamma coordination, and multisensory binding. This is not reduction, it is layering. Biology enables experience. Physics shapes stimulus. Architecture sculpts physics. Culture interprets experience. None of those layers cancel the others. Together they explain why these places feel like more than stone without requiring us to pretend they are supernatural machines. The mystery does not vanish under explanation. It changes register. It becomes more exact. That is also the place where the occult and the equation finally meet. Occult traditions speak of hidden harmonies. Science speaks of modal frequencies. Occult texts speak of vibration as primordial law. Physics speak of wave propagation. Esoteric cosmology speaks of unity through proportion. Acoustics speak of wavelength, volume, absorption, delay, and ratio. When Pythagoras described cosmic harmony, he used lyre strings and integer relationships. When an engineer calculates RT60, they use room volume and absorption coefficients. One vocabulary is poetic, the other is mathematics. Both are trying to describe how order can become audible. And that is why the stories endure even after the equations are known. Walk out of Hagia Sophia after chanting, and the last syllable is still fading inside you. The silence that follows is no longer empty because your nervous system has been modulated. Walk out of Newgrange at dawn after darkness, and resonance in the returning light feels overwhelming. Clap at Chichen Itza and hear the bird descend. And even once you know the mathematics of delay and reflection, the body still reacts before analysis arrives. The effect lands first. Explanation comes second. And the second never fully erases the first because the first is somatic. That is where memory enters. Sacred architecture does not only shape immediate perception, it shapes recall. High salience multisensory events are remembered differently. Contrast, repetition, reverberation, darkness, release, precession, and synchronization all intensify encoding. The body remembers what doctrine later explains. A person does not first master theology and then feel the building. Often the order is reversed. The building makes them feel something and belief arrives later to give that feeling language. Architecture prepares the ground into which doctrine can be planted. So what are sacred buildings actually doing? They are not proving God. They are not unlocking secret codes. They are modulating nervous systems, synchronizing groups, dramatizing cosmology through controlled vibration, and turning geometry into lived experience. And because human beings are vibrational organisms, that experience feels profound. Sacred architecture is applied to neuroacoustics before neuroscience, social entertainment before sociology, metaphysical theater grounded in wave physics. The stone sings not because it is alive, but because when shaped into chambers, vaults, passages, stairs, and domes, it traps and bends pressure waves in ways the body cannot ignore. Those waves strike the ear. The ear signals the brain. The brain shifts timing. Breath slows. The heart aligns. The crowd unifies. Meaning floods in. For a moment, inside a tomb, pyramid chamber, gallery, or dome, the boundary between matter and myth dissolves into oscillation. Then you leave. The echo fades, but the nervous system remembers. And memory becomes a story. Story becomes ritual. Ritual becomes tradition. Tradition becomes truth felt in the bones. That is the architecture of vibration. Hope you all enjoyed, and until the next one, everybody be well. Later.